I'd met a lot of women in my 63 years on this earth. I'd been married once before, briefly, in my 30s, and after that I'd told myself I was done with the whole business. Love, at my age, felt like something that belonged to younger men, men who still had the energy to be wrong about people. Then, I met Diane. She came into my hardware store on a Thursday afternoon in late October, looking for a specific kind of weather stripping for an old farmhouse door. Most people who come in asking about weather stripping don't actually know what they need. Diane knew exactly what she needed. She had a photograph of the door frame on her phone, she had the measurements written on a piece of paper, and she had 3 follow-up questions that told me she'd already done her research before walking through my door. I remember thinking, before I even knew her name, that whoever raised this woman had done something right. We talked for 40 minutes about weather stripping and eventually about everything else. She was 58. She'd been a school librarian for 26 years. She had warm brown eyes and a laugh that she seemed almost surprised by every time it came out of her, like she'd forgotten it was there. Before she left, I asked if I could take her to dinner. She said yes before I finished the sentence. That was 14 months before everything fell apart. I want you to understand something about those 14 months, friends, because it matters for what comes later. Diane wasn't just a woman I'd fallen for. She was the kind of person who made me feel like the better version of myself I'd always suspected was in there somewhere. She remembered small things. She asked real questions. When I talked about my late mother, she listened the way people only listen when they genuinely care. I thought, at 63 years old, that I had finally gotten lucky. The first time her family came up, we'd been dating about 6 weeks. I mentioned my sister Ruth and her kids in Flagstaff, mentioned that I tried to get out there at Thanksgiving, and asked if she had family nearby. Diane smiled in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes and said her family was complicated. I didn't push. Complicated families are not rare. I have a complicated family. I left it alone. But complicated, I would learn, meant something very specific to Diane, and the more time passed, the more I began to understand that the word was doing an enormous amount of work. By month 4, I'd met 2 of her friends, her colleague from the library and her neighbor, not one family member. When I asked if she had siblings, she said she was an only child. When I asked about her parents, she said they were both gone. Her mother had passed from cancer when Diane was in her late 30s. Her father, she said, had followed 2 years later. A broken heart, she called it. The way people do when they don't want to say the specific thing that killed someone. I believed her. Why wouldn't I believe her? She said it with the particular flatness of old grief, the kind that has been carried so long it doesn't ache the way it used to. I recognized that flatness. I'd had it myself after my own mother died. I didn't question it for a single second. When I proposed, 7 months in, she said yes. She cried. I cried a little too, which is not something I'm in the habit of admitting. We set the date for the following June. A small ceremony. We agreed. Neither of us wanted anything elaborate. My sister Ruth would come from Flagstaff. My 2 grown sons, Marcus and Daniel, would be there with their families. Diane said she'd invite a few close friends. She never mentioned family. I never thought to notice that she didn't. The thing that started it, the thing that cracked the wall just enough for the light to get in, was a form. A routine health insurance form that Diane needed to update after we got engaged. She had me listed as her emergency contact now, and she needed my information, and somehow in the back and forth of getting the paperwork sorted, she sent me a digital copy of her own form to pull her date of birth from. Her last name on the form was different. Not Calloway, which was the name I knew her by. The form said Calloway Pruitt, a hyphenated name. I sat with that for a moment. People use hyphenated names for all kinds of reasons. Maybe she'd been briefly married and kept part of it. Maybe it was a professional name situation. I set it aside. But that evening, for no reason I could have fully defended, I looked up Diane Pruitt in Hendricks County, Indiana, where she'd told me she grew up. I found a family, not a grave. Not an obituary. A family. There was a Leonard Pruitt, age 81, and a woman named Carol Pruitt, age 78, listed at an address in a town called Amo, Indiana, population just over 500. And there was a local community newsletter, the kind that small towns still print and post online. And in an issue from 3 years earlier, there was a small item about the Pruitt family's 50th wedding anniversary potluck at the First Methodist Church of Amo. It mentioned their daughter, Diane, who lived in Columbus, Ohio. Columbus, Ohio was where Diane and I had met. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time that night. I'm not a man who moves quickly when something shakes me. I've learned, at my age, that the worst decisions get made in the first hour after a shock. So I sat. I made myself a cup of coffee. I didn't drink. I looked at the ceiling. And then I went to bed and did not sleep until somewhere around 4 in the morning. The next day, I didn't say anything to Diane, nor the day after that. I needed to be sure I wasn't constructing something out of nothing, that there wasn't some explanation I was missing. Another Diane Pruitt from the same county. A family estrangement so complete that mentioning them felt equivalent to saying they were dead. I gave myself a week to think before I did anything at all. By the end of the week, I'd found a photograph. It was on a county library's digitized local history project, a picture from a 4-H fair from 1983. A girl of about 15, dark hair, warm eyes, grinning in front of a blue ribbon display. The caption read, "Diane Pruitt, Hendricks County, with her prize-winning strawberry preserves." Beside her stood a broad-shouldered man with a kind face and a woman with Diane's exact laugh lines, both of them looking at their daughter the way parents look at a child they are enormously proud of. The girl in the photograph was unmistakably my fiancée. Her parents were not dead. I booked a drive to Amo, Indiana on a Saturday, without telling anyone where I was going. It was 4 hours each way. I left at 6 in the morning. I'd written down the address from the newsletter and typed it into my GPS, and I drove west on I-70 with the radio off the whole way, just the road and my own thoughts, which were not particularly good company. Amo is a small town in the way that very few places still are. One main road, a post office, a grain elevator, a diner. The house I was looking for was on a county road 2 miles outside of town. A white ranch house with a vegetable garden along the south side, and a porch with 2 wooden rocking chairs, and a wind chime made out of old silverware. The yard was immaculate. Someone had pruned the rose bushes along the fence line recently enough that the cuts were still pale. I sat in my truck, in front of the house, for about 5 minutes. Then I got out and knocked on the door. The man who answered was Leonard Pruitt. He was 81 years old, shorter than I'd expected from the photographs, with white hair and the kind of careful, measured way of moving that tells you a man is in some pain but not willing to show it. He looked at me with polite caution, the way people in small towns look at strangers they don't quite recognize, not unfriendly, just waiting. I told him my name. I told him I was engaged to a woman named Diane, that she'd grown up in Hendricks County, and that I had driven 4 hours because I needed to understand something. The change in his face was the saddest thing I had seen in a very long time. He didn't speak for a moment. He stepped back and held the door open, and I went inside. Carol Pruitt came out of the kitchen drying her hands on a dish towel. She was a small woman with silver hair and Diane's exact eyes, and when she saw me she went very still, not frightened. More like a person who has been waiting for something for a long time and isn't entirely sure whether to be relieved or devastated that it has finally arrived. We sat at their kitchen table. They had a pot of coffee going, and Carol poured 3 cups without asking. There was a tin of butter cookies on the table, and she pushed it toward me the way you do for company even when nothing feels like a social occasion. Leonard talked first. He told me that Diane had left Amo at 22, gone to school in Columbus, built a life there, that they had been close once, that something had shifted, gradually, over the years, as Diane moved into a different world, a world with wine tastings and academic conferences, and a certain kind of person who didn't know what a grain elevator was. He said this without bitterness, which was the part that hit hardest. Carol told me that Diane had called them less and less, that she'd stopped inviting them to Columbus, that the last time she'd seen her daughter in person was 4 years ago, at a cousin's funeral, and that Diane had hugged them briefly and spent most of the reception on her phone. They did not know about me. They did not know about the engagement. They had not been told there was a wedding coming. I asked them, as gently as I could, whether Diane had ever told them she'd told people they were dead. Carol looked at her hands. Leonard looked at the window. We've wondered, Leonard said finally, why none of her friends ever seemed to know we existed. I drove home in a different kind of silence than the one I'd driven there in. I want to be honest with you about what I felt, because I think this is the part where a lot of stories get told wrong. I was not purely angry. I was not heroic. I was grief-stricken in a way I hadn't expected, because somewhere underneath the betrayal I was mourning the woman I'd thought Diane was, the woman who listened the way she listened, who laughed like she was surprised by it, who knew exactly what kind of weather stripping she needed. That woman had been real, at least partly. That was the part that hurt most. But I had also spent a lifetime watching people run from who they came from, and I knew what it cost. Not the person doing the running, the people left behind. Leonard and Carol Pruitt had done nothing wrong. They were good people who had raised a daughter the best they knew how, and found themselves erased from her story when her story became inconvenient. And they were in their 80s. They were not going to have unlimited chances to set this right. I decided I was going to give them one. I didn't confront Diane immediately. I took 3 weeks. In that time, I did 2 things. First, I called Ruth in Flagstaff and told her everything. Ruth is 10 years younger than me and considerably more practical, and she said, in her characteristic way, "Well, are you going to fix it, or are you going to just be sad about it?" I told her I was going to fix it. She said, "Good." Second, I called Marcus, my older son, who is a steady and level-headed man, and asked him to be available in June at a date 1 week before the wedding date. I didn't tell him the full story yet, just asked him to hold the date. Then I called Leonard Pruitt. I told him what I was planning. I told him I wasn't doing it for drama. I wasn't doing it to humiliate Diane or to blow up her life out of spite. I was doing it because he and Carol deserved to be in the room, and because I thought, on some level, that Diane deserved the chance to face what she'd done instead of carrying it forever like something buried in a wall. I told him if he didn't want any part of it, I would understand completely and I would find another way. There was a long pause on the phone. "We'll come," Leonard said. "We've been waiting to come for a long time. I planned a dinner at my house. I told Diane it was an engagement celebration, that I wanted Marcus and Daniel and their wives to finally spend some time with her in a proper sit-down setting before the wedding chaos started. She was happy about this. She wore a blue dress. She brought a lemon cake from the bakery she liked on 5th Street. She did not know that I had also invited Leonard and Carol Pruitt, who arrived quietly at 6:15 and were already seated in the living room with cups of tea when Diane walked through the front door carrying her lemon cake. I watched her see them from the hallway. I want to tell you that she broke down immediately, that the love for her parents overwhelmed the lie and everything resolved itself in a rush of tears and forgiveness. I want to tell you that because it would be a more comfortable story, but that is not what happened. What happened was that Diane went white. She looked at her parents, then she looked at me, and I could see her mind working, running calculations, looking for an exit, trying to find the version of events where she could still manage this. There wasn't one. Marcus and Daniel were there. Ruth had driven up from Flagstaff specifically for this. Leonard and Carol were sitting in my living room with their tea. Diane's lemon cake was in my hands. There was nowhere to go. I said, quietly, "I'd like you to have dinner with your parents, Diane. They drove a long way." She sat down. We had dinner. It was one of the most uncomfortable meals of my life, and I have been through some uncomfortable meals. Carol, to her credit, was gracious in a way that shamed everyone in the room, including me. She asked Marcus and Daniel about their children. She told a story about Diane's prize-winning strawberry preserves at the 4-H fair, and she told it warmly, with love, without a trace of accusation. Leonard ate quietly and said little, but twice I caught him watching his daughter with an expression that I cannot fully describe, part grief, part something that hadn't quite given up being pride. After dinner, my sons took their families to the other room. Ruth took Carol to see the back porch. Leonard excused himself to use the restroom. Diane and I sat alone at the table. She started with an explanation. The explanation was complicated and not entirely without logic. She'd felt, for years, like her parents belonged to a version of herself she'd worked hard to leave behind. That bringing them into her new life felt like putting two worlds in collision that weren't meant to touch, that she hadn't planned for it to go this far. It had just accumulated, the way avoidance accumulates, one small choice at a time until the small choices have built a wall you can't see over. I listened to all of it. I let her finish. Then I said, I understand all of that, and I need you to understand something. I don't need you to be someone whose parents had money or status or connections. I never needed that. I need you to be someone who doesn't erase people who love her because they're inconvenient, and I don't think you're there yet. She asked if we could get through the wedding and work on the rest. I told her I didn't think we could. I took the ring she'd worn for 7 months off her finger. She didn't resist, and I set it on the table between us. Not as a gesture, not as a symbol. Just because it belonged to a version of the future I was no longer building, and I didn't know what else to do with it in that moment. Then I went and found Leonard and Carol, and I told them that dinner wasn't over, and that I had a very good bottle of wine I'd been saving, and that I wanted to hear more about Amo, Indiana, if they were willing to tell me. Carol laughed Diane's same surprised laugh and said she thought they could manage that. Leonard shook my hand. He held it for a moment longer than a handshake requires, and he looked at me the way a man looks at another man when words don't quite get to the thing he means. I nodded. He nodded. That was enough. Diane left before the wine was opened. I heard the door. I did not follow her. The rest of that evening was, against all odds, a genuinely good one. Leonard turned out to be a man with a remarkable memory for the specific details of things, the exact variety of apple in an orchard he'd tended as a boy, the name of every dog he'd ever owned, the precise year a particular road in Hendricks County was paved. Carol told a story about the winter of 1987 that made Ruth laugh so hard she had to put down her wine glass. My granddaughter, who Marcus had brought along, fell asleep on Carol's lap, and Carol held her with the practiced ease of a woman who has been holding children her whole life and considers it one of the privileges of existence. Somewhere around 10 o'clock, when Leonard was getting tired, you could see it in the way he'd gone quiet, I helped them out to their car. Carol hugged me at the door. She smelled like the kind of soap that comes in a paper wrapper, the no-frills kind. She said, "You're a good man. I'm sorry it went the way it did." I told her I wasn't entirely sorry, that I'd gotten to meet her. She patted my arm and got in the car. I'm telling you this story, friends, not because it has a triumphant ending. There was no triumphant ending. Diane and I did not reconcile. I didn't want to, and I think on some level she understood why. The wedding did not happen, and the deposits were mostly lost, and there were phone calls and conversations in the weeks that followed that I will not go into because they don't add anything to what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is this. At 63 years old, I had the great good fortune to meet someone who showed me, clearly and without ambiguity, who she was before I was bound to her in a way that would have made the truth much more expensive. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a lot. And Leonard and Carol Pruitt drove 4 hours from Amo, Indiana, and sat at my kitchen table, and ate roasted chicken and green beans, and drank a wine they probably wouldn't have chosen themselves, and for one evening they were not invisible. Their daughter had spent years making them small. I don't have the power to undo that. But I had one evening, and I used it, and I think it mattered. Leonard called me the following month. He didn't have a specific reason for calling. He'd been thinking about something I said about my hardware store and wanted to ask a question about a hinge mechanism on his barn door. We talked for 45 minutes. He's called twice since then. I've started thinking of him as a friend, which is perhaps the strangest and most unexpected thing to have come from any of this. Some things, I have found, come from the ruins of other things. You don't plan them. You don't deserve them, particularly. They just arrive. The way a woman once arrived in my hardware store with measurements written on a piece of paper and questions that told me someone had raised her right. The door I was trying to weatherstrip all along, it turns out, was a different one entirely. Sometimes the person who reveals the deepest truth about your life isn't the one you planned to build it with. It's the stranger sitting quietly at your kitchen table, holding your granddaughter while she sleeps, smelling like paper-wrapped soap. Don't wait for a perfect reason to reach towards someone who's been made invisible. One honest evening, one open door, One bottle of wine, shared with the right people, that's often all it takes to find your way back to what matters. A small note for you: this story was created and fictionalized by AI, crafted to bring you a meaningful moment of entertainment, while also carrying a small, genuine lesson worth keeping.